video on how I use the performance timeline in Chrome to get an overview of what's going in my app and maybe find some opportunities to optimize. So right now I'm just going to do a local build and run my app locally on localhost and do a quick performance analysis. So yeah, I've done a local build. I'm just going to spin up a local server. This is a Next.js app running Preact. I've already done my kind of a load of optimizations on this, but a few people asked how I use the performance timeline, and I thought just running through on here might help. So yeah, so now I'm going to jump over to my app. If I refresh it, let's see it's working okay. So if we start from scratch, this is the app. If I open up the devtools, you can, I've got it on mobile view here. But yeah, so we're going to look at the performance panel here. Usually what I do is open up performance panel and I'll whack it on 6x slowdown. So this just simulates a much slower device, and it's much better than running it at your normal MacBook capabilities, because you get it will accentuate any bottlenecks in your app, and it'll give you a more realistic picture of how this might run on mobile or some of the slow mobiles out in the wild. So here I'm just going to do a quick performance timeline of how the app loads, because that's one of the things, or the main thing that Lighthouse analyzes in your app. And as largest contentful paint and other metrics are becoming more and more important for your site to be super usable and to also perform well in the Google's Web Vitals stats, then they're getting more and more important to understand these metrics. So okay, so I'm going to go. I've got the performance panel open. I've got it set to 6x slowdown. I'm going to hit record and then I'm going to refresh the app. Okay, so there we go. It's still doing something, and that stopped. So it might be a bit painfully slow to see your app running at 6x slowdown, but it's great in these timelines because it just magnifies any problems. And you'll usually see lots of these tellings off of looking like everything is horrendously slow, but once you've got over that, it's fine. So I'm just going to run through what I look at when I start, once I've done one of these profiles. So initially, to get an overview, it's great to look at the network panel. So here, initially you can see the document loading, and this is the very first thing that happens. When you refresh the page, the browser goes off and gets the HTML document. And then you can see a load of assets coming down. And these are, in my case, scripts. They're all the bundles that make up my application. And essentially you can see that they kick off like a little sooner than the HTML's all finished. And that's because I'm using resource hints, or Next.js is using resource hints on my behalf, to prioritize or tell the browser that, hey, these scripts are super important, get them downloaded as fast as possible. So yeah, I've got quite a nice clean network timeline now, because this is after I've done all my optimizations, but you might see a load of junk coming on here, like I did before. Got loads of third-party scripts coming in. You may have stuff that's being loaded right up front that doesn't even need to be there for a long time. So it's good to just get a glance at that and work out like what is actually being pulled down right away, and does that stuff need to be pulled down. Okay, so if we close off that, then we can look into actually the processes, like what was the browser doing in these stages. So I'm going to open up that, open up the timings, and I'm going to open up the main analysis of what's going on the main thread. So actually, if we just look at the timings, because this is an Next.js app, we have a nice sort of high-level overview of what was going on the main thread. from the user timings API that Next.js has used, which is cool. So you can see here, before hydration, so it's basically like getting all the assets downloaded. Next.js hydration is when all the assets are downloaded, and we're inflating our components. We're hydrating our components, making them interactive, making sure that what was rendered on the server matches what was rendered on the client, just reconciling the component tree, basically. And that's an interesting part of optimization that I'll go into briefly in a little bit, but let's open up this main panel here. Now, I think this is kind of probably the scariest part of the performance timeline. Loads of weird browser internal processes and tasks going on here, but eventually you get an idea of what's of interest to you and what's not. So up front here, like we know no scripts have actually started yet. We're just looking at parsing the initial HTML document, interpreting some styles that were in that document, and getting towards that first paint of the page. So yeah, we can just browse around, hover on these things, and look at what's going on. When you click on each of these tasks, you get a little bit more information about what was going on. So paint events, for example, you can see, oh look, it was actually painting this part of the document. That's interesting. Does that need to be should that be happening at that point in time? Is it a priority? So that's cool stuff. But yeah, so I'll move on. Like you can see here, we've got where are we? Yeah, so if we get our timings back up at the top here, you can see, yeah, we're still in the before hydration period here. So this basically means that the browser is interpreting all the JS that has finished downloading. It's actually stepping through each part of all of your JavaScript code that's been downloaded and saying, oh, what's in here? What should I do? Blah 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 blah. So in our case, you've got all your framework code and you've got all your app code all working together to kind of boot up the app. Now this is an interesting point in the to debug because this is production optimized, so you can see all the names are like minified and mangled here. But if you run a timeline in a development environment, these will make a little bit more sense to you. You'll see names of framework functions. You'll see your own functions in here, and you can dig in and decide. I can see that the hero component is being the hero module is being downloaded and that's being interpreted. I can see that my button module is being downloaded and interpreted. So all those things, and this is actually a good place in the timeline to see certain things that are being done or certain code that's being evaluated that may not need to be evaluated at this point in time. Always asking yourself, is that module critical to painting of this first above the fold, what's in the viewport? And if it's not, that could be an opportunity to defer a lazy load or code split that chunk out and do it later. In my case, one of those opportunities that I spotted was these overlays here. So I got my share overlay, and I noticed that it was being downloaded as part of this initial bundle, and that's something that's not needed for a long time, may not ever be needed. So yeah, that was something that I used the Webpack code splitting to lazily import that module. You can either do it after the app's booted or actually do it on demand when the user clicks that button. It all depends on your use case, but in this example, we're talking about removing code out of that critical path that's not needed. So yeah, and this module can actually be quite big. Like each of these buttons does something specific, so you can pull out like tens of Ks of JS from here, and that will reduce this evaluate module time period. So by hovering over these at the top of the stack, you can see how much time it took to do all the events underneath. And Chrome will tell you off with this little red triangle when something looks like it takes a long time. But usually when an app's booting, like stuff does take a long time, and especially because you've got this 6x slowdown. it's going to look bad. But I'm pretty pleased with where this is now, because before my optimizations, it was coming in at like 3 seconds to do all this stuff, maybe even longer. So I'm pretty pleased with that. So then we move on to this next stage, which is the Next.js hydration. So Next.js said it took around a second to do the hydration. And if you haven't heard the term hydration before, that's when, you take the modules, you take all the static HTML that came down in the document, and then you boot it up and make all those components interactive. This is a great place for optimization, because actually initially you only really need to make this above the fold viewport interactive. The stuff further down the page doesn't need to be interactive at all. So all these buttons don't actually need to be interactive in the first critical, like 2 or 3 seconds of the app start. So what you can do is you can defer or lazily hydrate some components after the critical loading of the app. And that's a great way to shove a load of that React reconciliation, hydration stuff further down the line. And I'll show you a little later on in the timeline where that's done. And here, after the components are all hydrated, you'll probably see some callbacks happening. Timer fired in the case of Preact and probably React is usually when the component did mount or use effect callbacks trigger. And this can be a place where lots of expensive stuff happens, especially if you're measuring documents, measuring elements in the document, or just doing a lot of work. So you can see here, like maybe that stuff doesn't need to be done up front. In my case here, I've got this balanced text module, and I've used my own user timing wrappers around this use effect callback to highlight in the timeline exactly how long that's taking. It's not too bad. Here we're seeing seeing 30 milliseconds, but it could be longer. But it's basically a little module which takes this title text and decides whether it needs to be wrapped, and then if it does, then it wraps it in a pretty way instead of like a horrible unbalanced way. If I was going to optimize ending on this page, I think that would be a great place to start, and not running this work if I don't have to. In this case, the text didn't wrap, so yeah, but that's a detail about my app. It's not really that generic. But you can see how the layout events have happened here. The DOM has changed, so then parse HTML is kicking in. Recalc style change kicks in because the DOM has changed, and layout happens because the styles have recalculated. So there's lots of things there, and then I believe maybe this part is probably a side effect of this work. So actually, although this balanced text event only says 32 milliseconds, it could actually be way longer. It could encompass all this stuff. You can see here if I hover over the paint event that it is actually repainting that title text there. So yeah, so these kind of style paint side effects can drift way outside where they were actually triggered, or the origin of what actually caused them to happen. So yeah, this could be a nice optimization, but yeah, I've already done a bunch of optimizations and I can't be asked it's not a massive amount of time, but it is something that I could improve. And this final chunk here, this is an interesting point where I've deferred the hydration. So all my critical stuff, or most of my critical hydration, happens here. And this should be just the modules above the viewport. And then I've used a technique called lazy hydration. You can read up about it a little bit, but I've got a component called lazy hydrate that I wrap certain chunks of my React tree in this case from these buttons downwards, and I say, hey, don't hydrate, like don't do any React work on this chunk until the app is finished booting up. So yeah, that's a real brief overview of how I use timelines to monitor or analyze the startup of an app, and gives you an overview of some optimizations I've made. Oh yeah, one other thing that's really important to note is these little metrics up here. So you've got first paint, first contentful paint, first meaningful paint, document loaded or DOM content loaded, largest contentful paint. And this is like a really important one now. Has been super prioritized in the Lighthouse scoring. So for me, this was really important. And then you've got the final document load here. So that means all your assets are finished loading. And the scripts have evaluated and all that. But for me, like this metric, this largest contentful paint metric, used to be way back here after load. And I'll dig in briefly about how I made that a bit better. But I did another video about image loading and how to get your images showing as fast as possible. Because usually largest contentful paint is tied to an image that's above in the viewport when the page loads, because that usually is the largest thing on the page. So getting that to load as fast as possible is really important. And I'm quite pleased with where this metric is now, because I'm actually hitting largest contentful paint before any of these scripts have started evaluating. So that basically means that the initial HTML payload, the initial document, has everything it needs to paint that largest contentful paint. It doesn't even need the bundles to download. And yeah, the way I did that was to inline all the JS that's needed to fade this image in. Previously, I was waiting here for the component did mount callback to decide whether or not to fade the image in. So it's actually a tiny little tweak, but you only analyzing these performance timelines do you see those opportunities. And now that's pulled right forward, and I'm getting a really good time. And it's actually quite nice because this fade in animation is happening while all the scripts and stuff are downloading and piling. So it's just a much nicer experience. If I refresh, you can see that image coming in, fades in while the bundles are still loading, bundles loading, stop. So yeah, that is a very long time, but obviously we've got the 6x slowdown. Yeah, so you can always also use the timeline panel, the performance timeline panel, to not just measure document load, but to measure actual interactions on the page. For example, I've got this scroll event here, which does certain stuff. It fades the background in and out. That took a lot of work to optimize that to get it super smooth. Without the performance panel, I wouldn't have been able to do that. It's kind of janky on this 6x slowdown, and I actually don't know if it's gonna struggle to create this profile. Forget it. There you go. We've got a little bit here, so you can see all my scroll events happening. But one of the things, when you're doing one like rule of thumb is with performance timelines is just keep them as short as possible, because there's a lot of noise here, and if you're profiling a single event, so let's say opening this sidebar, for example, I want to see, like, is that performing well? I would start the performance timeline, open the sidebar, stop the performance timeline as fast as possible, so I've got a nice, clean flame graph to look at, and I'm not distracted by other stuff that's going on in the background and trying to find the bits that matter to me. So here's we've got our click event, and then here we've got a bunch of stuff relating to the animation of the sidebar sliding out. And then here at the end, once the animation is finished, I then kick in a set state in React to say, by the way, the sidebar is open now, and that allows parts of the sidebar to respond and lazy load bits in. So yeah, in this case, like, one of the things I learned is just or probably a great rule of thumb is when you're animating anything, don't use React to trigger, don't use state to trigger an animation. And B, if you need to do stuff if you need to do React stuff after the animation, or as a consequence of the change in UI, do it after the animation. So trigger the animation, wait for the animation to finish, then set state and do all your stuff. Because if I were to open this sidebar using state, and then I had other stuff going on like lazy loading instantly, then this whole animation would be destroyed, and janky and horrible. So keep your main thread completely unblocked while you're triggering and the animation's in progress. And then afterwards, once the UI is settled down, do any state updates you need to. So that was a little tip there. Yeah, so I've been rambling a bit, but it's easier for me to do these kind of videos where I just talk and don't spend loads of time. I'll do more videos if I can just get on here and record and just ramble and talk as I go, than if I were to just do polished, super edited videos. So yeah, hope you understand, and no hard feelings if you didn't make it this far. But yeah, if you have any questions or you want me to deep dive into any of these topics in a bit more detail, then let me know and I'll do some follow-up videos. Cool.